In a rural area where luxury clashes with extreme poverty, a timid 12-year-old girl walks through the iron gates of the town's most notorious livestock auction yard. Her worn-out sneakers and carefully patched jeans reveal her family's desperate situation, but she carries a small mason jar filled with crumpled bills she saved for months by cleaning stables and selling eggs from her family's 3 chickens. The day before, she had witnessed something that broke her heart into 1,000 pieces. A massive black bull being mocked and feared by everyone at the auction. They called him Devil's Shadow, claiming he was cursed and brought misfortune to anyone who owned him. But when little Emma Rodriguez looked into those dark, intelligent eyes, she saw something completely different. Now she makes the bravest decision of her young life, to buy the bull that no one else wanted. When she approaches the wealthy auctioneer Vincent Blackstone and states her intention, the man bursts into cruel laughter along with his rich friends. A beggar girl wanting to play rancher, they mock. But the businessman accepts her meager savings just to humiliate her further, handing over the cursed bull for pocket change. What happens next will shock everyone and prove that sometimes the most broken souls carry the greatest gifts. The morning sun filtered through the dust-covered windows of Riverside Livestock Auction, casting long shadows across the wooden floors stained with decades of cattle trading. The aroma of hay mingled with the scent of leather and sweat, while the rhythmic sound of hooves echoed through the cavernous building. It was a world that seemed to exist in a different century, far from the reality of Emma Rodriguez, who walked timidly through the main entrance. Her sneakers, held together with silver duct tape, made soft squeaking sounds against the worn floorboards. The clothes she wore had been carefully mended by her grandmother's patient hands, each patch telling a story of poverty carried with quiet dignity. In her small fists, she clutched a mason jar where she kept every dollar bill she had earned over the past 6 months through back-breaking work that no child should have to do. Emma's family lived in a trailer on the outskirts of town, where her father Miguel worked double shifts at the meat processing plant, and her mother Rosa cleaned houses for wealthy families who barely acknowledged her existence. They had moved to Texas from Mexico when Emma was 5, chasing the American dream that seemed to slip further away with each passing year. Yesterday's events still echoed in her memory like a nightmare that refused to fade. While delivering eggs to Mrs. Henderson's ranch as she did every Saturday, Emma had stopped by the auction yard hoping to see the beautiful horses she dreamed of someday owning. Instead, she witnessed a scene that would haunt her forever. In the center pen stood the largest bull she had ever seen, a massive black Angus with shoulders that seemed to scrape the sky and eyes that held depths of intelligence and pain. But it wasn't his size that captured Emma's attention. It was the way everyone treated him. Auction workers approached his pen with fear and disgust, poking him with electric prods and making jokes about his supposed curse. "That's Devil's Shadow," she had heard an old cowboy explain to his companion. "Every owner he's had has met with terrible luck. Lost their fortune, their family, some even died in freak accidents. That bull's got the devil in him, I tell you." But when Emma looked into the bull's eyes, she saw something entirely different. She saw the same loneliness that lived in her own heart, the same feeling of being unwanted and misunderstood. She saw pain, intelligence, and a desperate need for someone to see past the fear and superstition. Now, with her heart pounding like a drum in her chest, Emma was making the most important decision of her 12 years of life. Each step toward the auction ring was a battle against the terror that tried to paralyze her small frame. The wealthy cattle buyers who milled around the building looked at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disdain, as if her presence somehow contaminated their exclusive world. Vincent Blackstone stood at the center of it all like a king holding court. At 55, he was a man who had built his fortune through shrewd cattle dealing and had never met a business opportunity he couldn't exploit. His expensive cowboy hat sat at the perfect angle on his silver hair, and his custom-made boots probably cost more than Emma's family made in 3 months. His small, calculating eyes constantly surveyed the crowd, looking for weakness he could exploit for profit. Emma stopped at the edge of the auction ring, gathering every ounce of courage she possessed to interrupt the conversation between Blackstone and his wealthy associates. For a moment, her resolve wavered as she remembered her father's worried face when he explained why they couldn't afford new school clothes this year, and the tears her mother tried to hide when she thought no one was watching. Was she being selfish, spending her family's emergency money on a bull when they could barely afford groceries? But then the image of Devil's Shadow returned to her mind with overwhelming force. Those intelligent eyes pleading for understanding, the proud posture of an animal who had never surrendered, despite all the cruelty he had endured. Taking the deepest breath of her life, Emma stepped forward and cleared her throat. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice small but determined. "I'd like to buy the black bull." The laughter that erupted was like an explosion of cruelty that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The cruel laughter echoed off the auction house walls like a symphony of contempt. Emma felt her face burn with shame, but she kept her feet firmly planted on the sawdust-covered floor. Vincent Blackstone wiped tears from his eyes, still shaking with amusement, while his wealthy associates exchanged looks as if they were watching the most entertaining comedy show of their lives. "Did you hear that, gentlemen?" Vincent announced to his companions, his voice dripping with mockery. "The little Mexican girl wants to buy Devil's Shadow. She probably doesn't even know the difference between a bull and a cow." The renewed burst of laughter was even more intense, and Emma felt something tighten painfully in her chest. One of the men, dressed in an expensive leather jacket, approached her with an air of superiority that made her want to disappear into the ground. "Little girl," he said in a condescending tone, "do you have any idea how much a bull like that costs? You couldn't afford to buy his feed for a single day, even if you sold eggs for the rest of your life." Emma clutched her mason jar tighter, feeling the weight of every dollar bill she had saved through months of backbreaking work. Each crumpled bill represented hours under the scorching Texas sun, mucking out stables while other kids her age played video games, enduring the condescending looks of wealthy ranch owners who treated her like she was invisible. "I have money," she said, her voice trembling slightly but not losing its determination. "And I know exactly which bull I want to buy." Vincent Blackstone leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the kind of cruelty that Emma had never encountered before. "Oh, really? And how much money does our little businesswoman have?" Emma unscrewed the lid of her mason jar with shaking hands and began counting the wrinkled bills onto the auction table. $237, she announced with as much dignity as she could muster. "Every penny I've saved for 6 months." The silence that followed was different from before. The men stopped laughing and stared at the small pile of money with expressions that mixed disbelief with something that might have been grudging respect. $237 was a significant amount for a 12-year-old child, especially one from Emma's circumstances. Vincent's cruel smile slowly returned as he realized this was an opportunity for even greater humiliation. "Well, well," he said, drumming his fingers on the table. "The girl actually has some money. But Devil's Shadow isn't just any bull, sweetheart. He's worth at least $10,000. The number hit Emma like a physical blow. $10,000. An amount so vast, she couldn't even properly comprehend it. She looked at her small pile of bills, which suddenly seemed ridiculously inadequate. "But," Vincent continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone about to deliver a particularly cruel punchline, "I'm feeling generous today. I'll make you a deal that you'll never forget. If this incredible story of courage triumphing over cruelty is touching your heart, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing true stories that will restore your faith in the power of determination over prejudice." Emma felt her heart leap with desperate hope, but something in the man's expression warned her that whatever was coming wouldn't be good. "I'll sell you Devil's Shadow for exactly what you have. $237, Vincent announced. The auction house fell completely silent except for the sound of Emma's rapid breathing. "Vincent, you can't be serious," interrupted one of his associates, a man in an expensive Stetson. "That bull has killed 3 owners through freak accidents. It's practically murder to sell him to a child." "Exactly," Vincent replied, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. "She wants to learn about the real world. Well, she's about to get the education of a lifetime. When that cursed bull destroys her family, and it will, she'll understand that some dreams are too dangerous for little girls from the wrong side of the tracks." Emma felt a chill run down her spine as the full scope of Vincent's cruelty became clear. He wasn't just selling her a bull. He was setting up her family for what he believed would be certain disaster. But as she looked across the auction yard toward Devil's Shadow's pen, she saw the massive bull watching her with those intelligent, pain-filled eyes. In that moment, Emma made a decision that would change everything. "I accept your deal, Mr. Blackstone." Vincent clapped his hands together as if applauding a performance. Wonderful. What a brave little girl. $237 for a bull that's worth a fortune, assuming he doesn't kill you first. Emma began placing her money on the table, bill by bill, while Vincent prepared the ownership papers with theatrical flourish. "There you go, sweetheart," he said, handing her the documents. "Devil's Shadow is now officially yours. I do hope you have good life insurance." The wealthy men around them chuckled at Vincent's joke, but Emma noticed that some of the regular auction workers were watching with obvious concern. These were men who had seen the bull's reputation firsthand and understood the magnitude of what was happening. "Ma'am," said an elderly cowboy named Pete, approaching Emma with genuine worry in his weathered face. "Are you sure about this? That bull? He's got a dark history. Every family that's owned him has faced terrible tragedy." Emma looked up at the kind old man, seeing real concern instead of mockery for the first time that day. "What kind of tragedies, sir?" Pete glanced nervously at Vincent, who was watching the conversation with amusement. "The Morrison family bought him 3 years ago. Within 6 months, they lost their ranch to bankruptcy, and their youngest son was paralyzed in a riding accident. Before that, the Williams family owned him for less than a year before their house burned down, and the father died in a freak farming accident." "Superstitious nonsense," Vincent interjected loudly. "Pure coincidence. Although I have to admit, the pattern is rather consistent." Emma felt her courage wavering for the first time. What if the stories were true? What if she was bringing genuine danger to her family? But then she remembered the look in Devil's Shadow's eyes. Not malevolent or evil, but deeply sad and desperately lonely. "Mr. Pete," she said quietly, "has anyone ever tried to understand why these things happen? Has anyone ever treated the bull with kindness instead of fear?" The old cowboy was taken aback by the wisdom in such a young voice. "Well, no, I suppose not. Most folks are too scared to get close to him." "Then maybe," Emma said with growing conviction, "the problem isn't the bull. Maybe the problem is how people treat him." Vincent burst into fresh laughter. "Oh, this is precious. The little girl thinks she can solve the curse with love and kindness. This is going to be even more entertaining than I hoped." But Emma was no longer listening to Vincent's cruelty. She was watching Devil's Shadow through the pen rails, and the massive bull was watching her back. For just a moment, she could swear she saw something like hope flicker in those dark eyes. What Emma didn't know was that her act of courage was about to set in motion events that would not only prove the bull's innocence, but expose a conspiracy of greed and manipulation that reached far deeper than anyone could have imagined. 3 weeks had passed since Emma brought Devil's Shadow home to her family's small property, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The massive bull that had terrorized 3 families now spent his days peacefully grazing in the makeshift pasture her father Miguel had constructed using salvaged materials and borrowed tools. Emma's parents had been shocked and terrified when she first explained what she had done, but they couldn't argue with the results. Devil's Shadow, whom Emma had quietly renamed Shadow, showed no signs of the violent behavior that had made him infamous throughout the county. Instead, he followed Emma around like a gentle giant, responding to her voice and seeming to understand her every word. "Mia," her father said one evening as they watched Shadow nuzzle Emma's hand through the fence, "I don't understand it. The stories about this bull, they were so terrible. But look at him. He's like a big pet." Emma stroked Shadow's massive head, feeling the trust that had grown between them over the past weeks. "Papa, I think the curse was never about Shadow. I think someone wanted people to believe he was dangerous." Her words proved more prophetic than she could have imagined. That afternoon, old Pete from the auction house arrived at their trailer, his weathered face grave with concern and something that looked like fear. "Emma," he said, glancing nervously around the property, "I need to tell you something that's been eating at me for years, about that bull and the families that owned him before you." They sat on the porch steps while Shadow grazed nearby, close enough to listen but far enough to seem non-threatening. Pete's hands shook as he pulled out a worn manila envelope filled with newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. "I've been keeping track of the accidents," he began, his voice heavy with guilt. At first, I thought it really was just bad luck, like Vincent said, but then I started noticing patterns that didn't make sense. Emma leaned forward, her heart beginning to race. What kind of patterns? Pete spread out the newspaper clippings on the small table. The Morrison family. Their financial troubles started exactly 1 month after they bought Shadow. But here's what nobody knew. Vincent Blackstone held the mortgage on their ranch. When they couldn't make payments, he foreclosed and bought their land for a fraction of its value. Emma's eyes widened as she began to understand. And the Williams family? Same thing, Pete continued, his voice growing stronger as he revealed the truth he'd kept hidden for too long. David Williams died in that freak farming accident just 3 days before he was supposed to testify in a lawsuit against Vincent's cattle dealing practices. The fire that destroyed their house? It started in the exact spot where Williams kept his evidence files. Emma felt a cold chill despite the warm Texas afternoon. You're saying Mr. Blackstone caused all those accidents? I'm saying, Pete replied carefully, that Vincent Blackstone has made a fortune buying up distressed properties from families who've had unexpected runs of bad luck. And every one of those families happened to own Devil's Shadow first. Emma's mother, Rosa, who had been listening from the doorway, came outside with a tray of iced tea. Her face was pale but determined. Senor Pete, are you telling us that our daughter bought a bull from a man who might try to hurt our family? Pete nodded grimly. Ma'am, I think Vincent expected Emma's family to meet with the same accidents as the others. Then he could swoop in and buy your land cheap, just like he's done before. Emma stood up abruptly, her fists clenched with righteous anger. That's why he sold Shadow to me for so little money. He wanted us to have the bull so he could blame whatever happens on the curse. But what about the curse itself? Miguel asked, joining the group on the porch. Why does everyone believe Shadow is dangerous? Pete's expression grew even more serious. Because Vincent made sure they believed it. Every time Shadow went to a new family, Vincent would tell them stories about the bull's violent nature, warn them to keep him isolated and controlled. He'd send his men around to check on the bull, making sure the families stayed nervous and suspicious. But Shadow isn't violent at all, Emma protested. He's the gentlest animal I've ever known. Exactly, Pete said. Because you treated him with kindness instead of fear. You never believed the stories, so you never created the conditions that would make them come true. Emma looked across the pasture at Shadow, who was watching their conversation with those intelligent dark eyes. So, all this time, Shadow wasn't cursed. He was just being used as a scapegoat for Mr. Blackstone's crimes. That's what I believe, Pete confirmed. And I think Vincent is getting nervous. Word's gotten around town about how well Shadow is doing with your family. People are starting to ask questions about the curse. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of expensive truck engines could be heard approaching down the dirt road. Emma's heart sank as she recognized Vincent Blackstone's black pickup truck, followed by 2 other vehicles filled with men she didn't recognize. Papa, Emma whispered. What do we do? Miguel Rodriguez stepped protectively in front of his family, his jaw set with determination. We tell the truth, mija, and we don't let anyone intimidate us. Vincent climbed out of his truck with the same arrogant swagger Emma remembered from the auction house, but there was something different in his eyes now, something that looked like desperation masked as confidence. Well, he called out loudly. Look who's still alive. I have to admit, Rodriguez family, you've lasted longer than I expected. That cursed bull hasn't killed you yet? Emma stepped forward before her parents could stop her. Shadow isn't cursed, Mr. Blackstone. You know that better than anyone. Vincent's smile faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed intensity. Oh, really? And what makes you so sure about that, little girl? Because, Emma said, her voice growing stronger with each word, Pete told us about the Morrison family and the Williams family and how you bought their land after their accidents. We know what you've been doing. The silence that followed was deafening. Vincent's face went through several expressions before settling on cold fury. Behind him, his companion shifted nervously, clearly not expecting this confrontation. You don't know anything, Vincent said quietly, but Emma could hear the threat in his voice. And you'd better be very careful about spreading rumors that could hurt a man's reputation. "The only thing hurting your reputation," Emma replied with courage that surprised even herself, "is the truth." What happened next would prove that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can expose the biggest lies, and that courage doesn't depend on size or wealth. It depends on having the strength to stand up for what's right. The tension in the air was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Vincent Blackstone's face had gone from confident mockery to barely controlled rage as he realized that his carefully constructed lies were unraveling before his eyes. Behind him, his hired men shuffled nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this confrontation was taking. "You've made a very serious mistake, little girl," Vincent said, in a voice that dripped with menace. "Accusing a respected businessman of criminal activity could get your family into a lot of trouble." But before Emma could respond, Shadow did something that shocked everyone present. The massive bull, who had been peacefully grazing throughout the confrontation, suddenly lifted his head and began walking directly toward Vincent with purposeful, measured steps. Vincent's companions immediately backed away, their fear of the supposedly cursed animal overriding their loyalty to their boss. But Shadow ignored them completely, his dark eyes fixed solely on Vincent with an intensity that made the older man visibly nervous. "Easy there," Vincent stammered, taking several steps backward toward his truck. "Keep that beast away from me." Emma watched in amazement as Shadow positioned himself directly between Vincent and her family, his massive frame serving as a living barrier. The bull wasn't aggressive or threatening. He was protective, standing guard like a gentle giant who finally understood who the real danger was. "Interesting," Pete observed loudly, his voice carrying across the yard. "Shadow seems to know exactly who's been causing all the trouble around here." At that moment, the sound of multiple sirens could be heard approaching down the dirt road. Emma's heart leapt as she saw Sheriff Patricia Mason's patrol car leading a convoy of law enforcement vehicles, followed by what appeared to be FBI agents in dark suits. Vincent's face went completely white as he realized the magnitude of his situation. "What is this?" he demanded, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. Sheriff Mason stepped out of her patrol car with a briefcase full of documents. "Vincent Blackstone, you're under arrest for insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit arson, and the murder of David Williams." The words hit like thunderbolts. Emma watched in amazement as FBI agents moved to surround Vincent and his men, while Sheriff Mason continued reading the charges. "We've been investigating your land acquisition scheme for 2 years," the sheriff explained to the gathering crowd. "Thanks to evidence provided by Pete Morrison and corroborating testimony from several victims' families, we finally have enough to prosecute." Emma looked at Pete with new respect and gratitude. The old cowboy had been gathering evidence and working with law enforcement all this time, waiting for the right moment to expose Vincent's crimes. "The curse of Devil's Shadow was nothing more than an elaborate cover story," Sheriff Mason announced. "Mr. Blackstone used intimidation, arson, and even murder to force families into financial distress, then purchased their properties for pennies on the dollar. Vincent tried one last desperate gambit. 'You can't prove any of this. It's all coincidence and speculation.'" Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI stepped forward with a thick folder. "Actually, Mr. Blackstone, we can prove it. We have bank records showing payments to known arsonists, recorded phone calls discussing accidents that needed to happen, and physical evidence linking you to the Williams house fire." Emma felt a surge of vindication and relief. All those families who had suffered and lost everything. They would finally get justice. "Furthermore," Agent Chen continued, "our investigation revealed that Devil's Shadow, now called Shadow, was deliberately mistreated and agitated before each sale to create the appearance of violent behavior. Veterinary records show evidence of drugging and abuse designed to make the animal appear dangerous." Emma's heart broke as she thought about what Shadow had endured, but she also felt fierce pride in how the gentle bull had overcome his traumatic past through love and proper care. As Vincent and his associates were handcuffed and loaded into police vehicles, Sheriff Mason approached Emma's family with a warm smile. "Emma Rodriguez," she said formally, "your courage in exposing this conspiracy has helped us bring a dangerous criminal to justice. The families of Vincent's victims owe you a debt of gratitude." 3 months later, Emma stood in the center of a transformed pasture, watching Shadow graze contentedly among a small herd of cattle that her family now owned. The lawsuit against Vincent Blackstone had resulted in a substantial settlement that allowed the Rodriguez family to purchase the land they had been renting and start their own small ranch operation. The other victims of Vincent's scheme had also received compensation from his seized assets, and several families had chosen to relocate to the area to start fresh near the people who had helped expose the truth. Pete had become like a grandfather to Emma, teaching her everything about cattle ranching and helping her family build their new life. Miguel had quit his job at the processing plant to focus on the ranch full-time, while Rosa had started a small business making traditional Mexican food for the growing community. "Emma!" called a familiar voice. She turned to see David Williams Jr., the son of one of Vincent's murder victims, approaching with his mother. The Williams family had used their settlement money to start a new life in Texas, and David Jr. had become Emma's closest friend. "Shadow looks amazing," David said, scratching the massive bull behind the ears. "It's hard to believe anyone ever thought he was dangerous." Emma smiled as she watched Shadow gently nuzzle the boy's hand. "People see what they expect to see, not what's really there." Shadow was never cursed. He was just waiting for someone to love him instead of fear him. Mrs. Williams, who had initially been terrified of the bull that she blamed for her family's misfortunes, now watched the gentle interaction with tears in her eyes. "Emma, your kindness didn't just save this animal. It saved all of us by exposing the truth about what really happened to our families." As the sun set over their thriving ranch, Emma reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying day at the auction house. A 12-year-old girl's act of compassion had not only saved a misunderstood animal, but had also brought justice to multiple families and exposed a criminal who might have continued hurting people for years. The curse of Devil's Shadow had finally been broken, not by magic or superstition, but by the simple power of seeing past fear to the truth underneath. And in that truth, Emma had found not just justice, but a new life filled with hope, community, and the knowledge that courage doesn't depend on size or wealth. Sometimes the smallest hearts carry the biggest capacity for love, and sometimes the most broken souls just need someone brave enough to see their hidden light. In the end, Emma Rodriguez had proven that the real curse was not love, but the fear that keeps us from showing it. As Shadow settled down for the night in his comfortable pasture, surrounded by his new herd and protected by the family who had saved him, the legend of the cursed bull became a story of redemption that would be told for generations. A reminder that sometimes the most beautiful endings begin with a single act of courage from the most unexpected hero.